Welcome back. It's been 2 weeks. In the last 2 weeks, we have made no progress, but I've got good news. Today we're going to actually get into the Bible. That's right. We're going to open up the Bible and we're going to go through all of 2 verses. The first 2 verses of the Bible. 2 verses is better than 1 verse. So, I don't think so. I think I alluded to it and we didn't quite get to it. Now, in fact, we're going to read some more of the Bible than just the 2 verses, but we're going to spend just our time on the first 2 verses of the Bible, because now we're actually going to get into the Genesis prologue proper, start diving into some text this week. And our subject matter for tonight, as I've written up here, is we're going to talk about God turning primordial chaos into a cosmic temple. But here's where I want to start tonight. This may surprise you, but there is more than one creation story in the Bible. The creation story that we're all basically familiar with is Genesis 1, which that portion runs all the way through chapter 2, verse 3, with the completion of the Sabbath. So this is the first creation story that most people know about. It's a big picture, however. It's a macro picture of creation. Creation on the biggest scale that the biblical authors could imagine. It's the creation story that most people are talking about because they're referencing the 7 days of creation. And it is the creation story that we will be talking about over the next 2 or 3 weeks as the formless and void chaos of the watery nothingness is transformed into the world as we know it. And the picture of this macro creation is that creation is a temple for God and his imagers to live in together. But immediately after this creation story, we get a different creation story, a micro creation story. Genesis 2, starting verse 4, running all the way through 25 of that, is the second creation story in the whole Bible. It is a micro picture between God and people. It is where he plants the garden as his home on earth, and it becomes the model for his imagers he's going to live there with to continue the work of turning the chaotic or disordered creation that still exists outside of the garden into what the garden is like. And it overlaps with chapter 1. It overlaps with the story of the macro creation. But they're trying to do different things. This is the second creation story, but there's actually more creation stories than that. And I'll give you a sampling of just 2 quick ideas from the Psalms. Psalm 74. The psalmist takes a short break from the rest of his writings to describe Yahweh killing Leviathan and creating the world. Verse 13 says, "It was you who split the sea by your power. You broke the heads of the monster in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave it as food to the creatures of the desert. It was you who opened up springs and streams and dried up the ever-flowing rivers. The day is yours and also the night. You established the sun and moon. It was you who set all the boundaries of the earth. You made both summer and winter." There he's reflecting on very similar language to God creating the sun, moon, and stars, which he does in Genesis 1. But there's nothing that mentions any creature called Leviathan there. But he's doing the exact same thing here that Genesis 1 is describing, because he's taking the watery chaos. Leviathan, as this picture will show you, is a mythological chaos monster of the sea. And the idea is that Yahweh, by killing Leviathan or conquering chaos, if you think mythologically, was how he actually created. But this isn't the only psalm that does something very similar to this. Psalm 89 takes a break from what it's doing throughout creation and says, Yahweh defeats Rahab, different from Rahab, not the prostitute of the book of Joshua. They're spelled exactly the same in English. They are not spelled the same in Hebrew. The difference is the corners of letters either don't touch or touch, and you have to be paying attention. But there's no good way to write it in English. So here in the text, I've actually just put a breath mark over it to distinguish it. But Psalm 89 says this: "You rule over the surging seas. When its waves mount up, you still them. You crushed Rahab like one of the slain. With your strong arm you scattered your enemies. The heavens are yours, and also the earth. You founded the world and all that is in it. You created the north and the south, Tabor and Hermon. Sing for joy at your name. Your arm is endowed with power. Your right hand is strong, and your right hand exalted." The point that I'm trying to get at is that there's lots of different ways that different authors, whom we've already had these discussions about different authors writing different ways, there's lots of different ways that you can actually describe creation. What does it mean to create? What is a creation? These fundamental questions that we assume we know the answer to, so we don't always bother to consciously ask ourselves the question, and we actively kind of glaze over the fact that the psalmist is describing creation in very similar terms as Psalm 74? Psalm 74, Leviathan, Rahab. This picture here, Rahab is another different chaotic monster of the seas. If you read Job 26:14, Rahab is the gliding serpent. It also is a term for Egypt in certain places. And in fact, in the prophets, this gliding serpent imagery seems to come from the Nile, which goes back and forth for 1,000 miles and stuff. And it seems to be the imagery and how they connect the gliding serpent of chaotic waters with Egypt, a big beast that you have to conquer in order to bring order to the world. So let's watch this video real quick from the Bible Project. This one, I've edited it so that it's only like 90 seconds, and we'll watch the rest of it some other time. But this is just a quick video to describe creation as a temple.
If you could go back to the city of Jerusalem during Bible times, the biggest thing you'd see is the temple.
This beautiful building was designed by King David and built by King Solomon, and they believed that it was the home of the God of the universe.
Wait, I thought God's home was in heaven.
Well, the whole point of this earthly temple is that it's the place that overlaps with God's heavenly home. The temple is where God lives and rules all creation as king.
That's cool, but even Solomon, who built the temple, didn't believe that it could contain the God of the universe, right?
Yeah, the building was just a symbol, and it pointed to the fact that all of creation is God's temple. And that's actually what the first page of the Bible, Genesis 1, is all about.
Really? It says that creation is God's temple?
Well, it doesn't need to say it. The whole story shows it. In Genesis 1, God creates an ordered world out of a dark wasteland by speaking in a series of 7 days. Then on the 7th day, God's presence fills creation as he takes up his rest and rule. Similarly, the tabernacle and later the temple were built and dedicated in a series of 7 speeches in 7 days, after which the priest or king could rest and rule in God's presence.
So all of creation is where God intends to dwell. It's like his temple.
Exactly.
That is a very simple introductory idea that's often overlooked. The reason I was trying to teach you some background on books of the Bible before we actually were diving into a book of the Bible is because you often have to pay attention to how books are constructed and put together to understand their meaning, especially deeply religious and theological books in the ancient world. How they're collecting different sources, editing them and compiling them into a new document is part of how they're making their arguments. And when you look at how the book of Exodus is put together, if you're looking for just, well, God rescued the people and they walked through the Red Sea on dry land, and then he met them at Sinai and they gave them a mountain covenant, and then he gave them a law, and then they worshiped a golden calf or something, and then you just leave out those last chapters, like the last 8 or 9 chapters that are actually about building the tabernacle. Then you're going to fail to understand that the book of Exodus is actually about God delivering his people so that he could build the tabernacle. He wanted to live on earth with them. That was what the entire book was leading to. It's not leading to the Exodus. The Exodus and the traveling to Sinai is all for the purpose of building the tabernacle so God and his people could live and dwell together. But God had to come down to his people. If you read Kings, where the opening chapters where Solomon is building the temple, it takes him 7 years. That is not a coincidence. The construction of the tabernacle across 7 communications of God. God said this and God said that. Build this, build that, and it wells up into a collection of 7 about constructing the tabernacle. And the temple taking 7 years is a pattern that is developing so that the author of Genesis, at least the Genesis prologue, which probably was the last part of Genesis to be written, as prologues often are, wanted to describe how God dwelled and lived in the world. And so he's writing across 7 days, a week, a short span of time, but trying to portray creation, not in literal terms of what happened, but in terms that an ancient Hebrew could understand, of saying, how should you think of creation? You're born down here, you're looking around. How should you think about the world that you live in and exist in? And how should you uncover your purpose in that world? The world was actually not made for you. The world was made for God. It was made by God, for God. And then he did something. He turned the world over to us. That's a macro, big picture idea. When you think about the world, you should think about living and existing in it in a way that you would any temple in the ancient world, any home for a god. There were rules that applied. You could not defile the god's home. You had to show respect. Well, all of life is basically one big temple. All of existence in the physical universe is one big temple. And it should color how you live and exist in that temple if you can think of it in those terms. We're too busy thinking scientifically and asking the wrong questions. So, the starting point for understanding the Bible at all, especially right at page 1, is that we have our modern minds and our modern thinkings, but we're trying to understand an ancient Near Eastern set of ideas. We use scientific language to build our communications about the world around us, and we have for about 400 years. The ancients did not have science. They did not have scientific language, which, by the way, is just Latin, but never mind that. Before scientific language took root, most language was what we call phenomenological. That's a big word that means something very simple. It describes the ways that things look to the human eye. That's all. Phenomenon. I saw something phenomenal. You saw something out of the ordinary. You saw something you didn't quite explain or can understand, but you saw something when you're explaining a phenomenon. Logical, the word just comes from the Greek word logos for word. Words that describe the way things look with the human eye. This is the language of the entire Bible, including the Genesis 1 creation story. All of the creation stories. It looks a certain way to us as we're living through it. And they're going to use the way that it looks in the human experience to communicate. They're not going to use science. Nobody understood it. God did not make them use science. God did not sit around waiting for them to develop scientific ideas so that he could communicate with humanity. He let humans write the text. He worked with humans to write it down, as we've talked about in our prolegomena stuff. And in so doing, he didn't require them to communicate things they didn't understand. And the things that they do understand, he's going to use it to communicate with everybody else in that ancient world. So, reading what's up here in white and what I've got highlighted, it says phenomenological language. Much of the Bible comes to us with language that describes the way things appear to the naked eye. The language used is descriptive of the ways that things look from our perspective and is not necessarily asserting precise scientific fact. An example of this is the description of the sun rising, or in our case, setting, right? And hitting you in the eye. Unless we understand the use of phenomenological language, we might think that the Bible teaches that the earth is the center of the universe. When we realize that the Bible describes things according to appearance, specifically according to the way humans perceive and experience life, we see that the Bible is not really saying that the sun revolves around the earth. Rather, it is merely saying that the sun rises because to our naked eye, it looks like the sun rises and moves and the earth does not. The use of this language is still current. The meteorologist gives us the time of sunrise, but nobody assumes they're teaching that the sun revolves around the earth. It's that simple. It's that obvious, and yet we overlook the obvious. Any questions on that before we move on? You're not sure you trust everything you see. That's probably a good thing because you don't understand everything that you see. You have to interpret it. So Genesis 1 is written by somebody who doesn't understand everything, but he's got to find a way to express God as king and creator to everyone around him. What can he understand and what can his audience that he's writing to understand? Temple literature. They understand what it's like for a God to live in a home. We'll talk about some other texts that help explain this shortly. It is probably a good thing to understand that you can't trust everything that you see because you don't understand everything that you see. I mean, that's how people could ask all the questions about who is Jesus and come up with all different answers. He's one of the prophets. He's John the Baptist, raised from the dead. He's the Christ, because they're seeing things, but they don't know how to interpret it or make sense of it. We have our interpretive schemes. What I want you to understand is, like we talked about with the lenses, our lens is a scientific lens in a postmodern rational age. Their lens, they didn't have the scientific lens. So they're just using language to describe things the way that it looks to their naked eye. Or you might see the same thing and just use different pictures to describe it entirely. They don't necessarily feel the need to reconcile that. They let different pictures hang. And you have to discover, it's the same thing with the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do not one-to-one correspond to each other because they're different authors, writing with different things in mind and wanting to emphasize and bring out different ideas. So they're going to look at the exact same thing differently. On Sunday morning, this past Sunday, when Terry was preaching out of John 12 and going over the woman, Lazarus' sister, Mary, breaking the jar of pure nard and wiping Jesus' feet with it, anointing him, and then wiping it with her hair. None of the other Gospels refer to her by name. None of the other Gospels say it was in Lazarus' house. In fact, they said it was in Simon the leper's house. So what are they doing? Is it a different person entirely? Did this thing happen twice with two different women? What's going on there? And they're not looking to reconcile the difference as authors. But we can do that as interpreters. There are good reasons to read that and understand the stories in multiple different ways. And eventually you just have to accept that we don't know everything and we don't have all the answers. Sometimes it doesn't matter. You're absolutely right. So what does matter? Here's a question even more basic than that. What is matter? What matters and why does that matter? Now, our modern day expectation is that it's physical matter that matters. So we want to naturally read Genesis 1 as if it's meant to tell us where physical material came from. as if it was written to answer our scientific questions just developed within the last 400 years. I mean, scientific language started being specific disciplines in the 1600s. That's our starting point. We like to think that we want to know, where did the atoms come from? We discovered physical material made up of compositions called atoms. Where do they come from? What is the nucleus? The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. What does that mean? Where did all of that come from? And we're trying to answer these questions. Because that is our starting point, these are the questions we're trying to answer, we assume that that was in the ancient person's mind, and that's what they were trying to answer. It wasn't, not even slightly. And what I'm trying to point out to you is that we can't take our modern expectations and impose them back on a text 1,600 years older than those questions being asked, and then shove the text into answering our questions. They're going to tell their own stories with their own points in mind to discuss and share different truth differently than we do today. And if you're going to learn to read your Bible to the best of your ability, you're going to have to accept that it's not going to answer all of your questions. That science can, as an art form, can be asking all the questions at once over here, and the Bible, being written by limited human authors, are only trying to answer so much here. The Bible is not exhaustive in all the questions that it could answer or is trying to answer that humans could ask. It is very limited. It picks and chooses what questions it's going to ask and what it's going to answer. So if it's not asking questions about physical matter, what is the point of a story of creation like Genesis 1, Genesis 2, Psalm 89, Psalm 74? Well, you have to compare ancient Near Eastern creation stories with ancient creation Near Eastern stories, because there's dozens of them that you can compare them to. I'll talk about a few shortly, but my point is this: all ancient Near Eastern writers, including the Hebrews, had a different set of presuppositions when it came to what a creation was and why it mattered. So the question is, what would an ancient Near Eastern Hebrew consider important about creation if not physical matter? Any thoughts? Anything you want to throw out? If they don't care about the physical material, what are they thinking a creation is? See, it's so hard not to think in the categories you've been thinking in your entire life. And that's okay. The answer is that all ancient people were trying to describe a function and a purpose within an ordered system. What that means is they're trying to tell you, this is who and what you are, and this is what you're here for. Let me read for you a little bit from a brilliant book called The Lost World of Genesis 1 by John Walton. I'm going to read for you like a page and a half of this. He breaks down his chapters. He doesn't number them chapters 1, 2, or 3. He names them propositions. So, proposition 2, concluding at the end of the chapter, he says, in conclusion, analysis of the ancient Near Eastern creation literature often observe that nothing material is actually made in these accounts. So if you read ancient creation stories, nothing material actually gets made. This is an intriguing observation. Scholars who have assumed the true acts of creation must by definition involve production of material objects are apparently baffled that all of these so-called creation texts have nothing of what these scholars would consider to be creation activities. I, John Walton, propose that the solution is to modify what we consider creation activities based on what we find in the literature. If we follow the sense of the literature and its ideas of creation, we find that people in the ancient Near East did not think of creation in terms of making material things. Instead, everything is function-oriented. You had to have a function, you had to have a purpose, or you are not considered alive or created. I'll give you an example. Let me just break the reading here. I'll give you an example. You go to IKEA. I got bookshelves from IKEA. I go to IKEA, I buy a box. It's got the material in it to create a bookshelf, but I don't have a bookshelf until I have assembled that and it can serve the function of holding my books on a shelf. I can call it a bookshelf, but it ain't a bookshelf. It is wood in a box. Until it can function as a bookshelf, it is not a bookshelf. Till you have assembled the couch that you can sit and lie on, you don't have a couch. You're not a thing until you can do the thing you're created to do. And the gods were the ones who created things with purpose in mind and gave them their purpose. It has nothing to do with physical material. So, picking it back up with Walton's words, the gods are beginning their own operations and are making all of the elements of the cosmos operational. Creation thus constituted bringing order to the cosmos from an originally non-functional condition. Keep that in mind, because when we come to verse 2, that should pop back up. It is from this reading of the literature that we may deduce a functional ontology in the ancient world. That is, that they offer accounts of functional origins rather than accounts of material origins. Consequently, to create something, cause it to exist in the ancient world, means to give it a function, not material properties. We need to note the contrast. We tend to think of the cosmos as a machine and argue whether someone is running the machine or not. The ancient world viewed the cosmos more like a company or a kingdom. Would they have believed that their gods also manufactured the material? Absolutely, for nothing can be thought to stand apart from the gods, but they show little interest in material origins. Such issues were simply insignificant to them. If we paused to think about it, we might begin to wonder why material origins have taken on such central significance for us. And it gives you two examples. Consider, as employees, we pay little attention to the history of the company we work for. We are more interested in the corporate structure and what responsibilities each department has. We want to know about who reports to whom and who is in charge of certain operations and tasks. When we go to the theater, we have a passing interest in the construction of the set, the stage works, etc., but we understand that the play exists in the roles of the performers. When a person comes late and asks what happens so far, the question is not answered by information about the costume designer, the script writer, and the hiring of the cast. Telling the person about all that would be offering the wrong sort of origins and information. Some sorts of origins were more important than other sorts of origins. In summary, this chapter has noted that our material definition of existence is only one possible way to define existence. I have suggested that the ancient world, they defined it differently. They thought of existence as defined as having function within an ordered system. John Walton is basically making the argument that all ancient societies, when they talked about creation, they talked about if you had all the material in the universe, and none of it serves any purpose, you don't have creation. It is not created yet. And until someone comes along and orders and manipulates all of creation to function towards a goal and a purpose, creation is useless, void, empty. And that is going... If you wanted to use the term assembling rather than creating, to help you think about it, that is probably fair to say that assembling creation in our language might be a fair way to describe what they're thinking. That in Genesis 1, God is not going to come and create physical material. It's already there. He's going to assemble that physical material. It doesn't mean that he didn't create it. It's just not going to bother telling us how that physical matter got there. And when we come to the story, you should be able to see why as I'm preparing you for it. Okay, go ahead. As far as Genesis 1 is concerned, Genesis 1 is not trying to tell you, here's how physical material came into being. Have you ever heard somebody describe creation out of nothing? Creation, they use the Latin scientific phrase ex nihilo. if you've ever heard that. That gets talked around in churches and Baptist churches and stuff. Yeah, good. So they're assuming, based on scientific questions, how did the physical material come into existence? When we get, I'm prompting you so that when you get to Genesis 1, verse 2, you realize the formless and void waters are already there. And then God says, let there be light. Exactly. You just never stopped and thought about it yet. But this is what I mentioned 2 weeks ago. You cannot ask a question of the Bible that somebody else has not done the hard work to answer. Our scientific ideas are imposed onto the Bible is trying to compare apples to oranges. You have to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. You have to compare the biblical creation stories with ancient Near Eastern creation stories. And when you do, you realize they're all about not physical material coming into existence. They're all about the arranging of physical material by the gods to create an orderly, functional world that humans live in. It doesn't mean that God didn't create physical material. It's just not the point of the story. Exactly. When the Bible says God created everything, that gives him the creator, the credit for being the creator, it implies that he created the physical material, that the physical material is not eternal. God alone is eternal. It's just not going to tell you where that physical material came into. Exactly. That is a good way to understand. Yeah, that is a good way to understand how Genesis, the author of Genesis 1, is writing his story and what he is and is not trying to communicate. Okay, now there are 3 ancient Near Eastern ideas to understand before we read Genesis 1. Number 1. Creation of physical material is irrelevant to the story of Genesis 1. That's what we've already said. That's the conclusion of the matter. Instead, it is creation of form and function is what matters most. Even when you think about, just jumping ahead to the idea of Genesis 2, where God forms man from the dust of the earth. He doesn't create new dust out of nothing and then form the man's body. He takes the dust and he forms a man's body. Then he breathes into it the breath of life. I want you to see that the same thing is basically what the story is about in Genesis 1. The land comes forth out of the waters, but it was presumably always there. And we'll talk more about what that means, okay? So form and function is what matters, not physical matter. Genesis 1 does not answer questions about the universe's physical origins or its life, its development of life. How did we get here? That is not the question that the text is trying to answer. Why are we here? What is our purpose? It is telling a story revolving around answering that question. Why are we here and what is our purpose? Exactly. And it's going to have to describe, well, the creation is formed like a temple. What does that mean? How do you live like you were everywhere you went as a temple? See? He is familiar with it. He alludes to it, but he doesn't directly talk about it. Exactly. Paul's notion of your body as a temple is based on our original created purpose and the fact that in Messiah you can live up to that created purpose again. And so he will describe it as you are the living temple. So go out there and live as a living sacrifice. He will use temple language all over the place because he understands Genesis 1 is the story of God forming the world like it's a temple. Number 2, when God begins creating in Genesis 1, the material already existed. It was useless, however, because it served no function. And I'm telling you this because if I tell it to you, the second we go and read it, you'll be like, oh, okay, I never thought of it that way. And then you'll never be able to unthink about it again. Material existence was formless and void, empty in the NIV, but I think void is probably a little bit better of a term. However, our idea for void is like we think of outer space as a void. No air, no stuff like that. You can't exist and live in it. Devoid of physical material is how we think of void. their ability to describe the void was, no matter how much physical material you have, if it can't support life, if it's pure chaos, then it's void, and somebody needs to come along and create. Create what? Create order out of the chaos. And that's what every ancient Near Eastern mythological creation story is trying to do, including Genesis 1, that is living and swimming in those rivers. Finally, number 3. In ancient Near Eastern creation stories, it's the gods who fight for domination, and the victor gets to establish the world as they see fit to rule it. If you're looking for a fancy term to sum that up, theomachy, the gods fighting. And you will find that in just about every creation story apart from Genesis 1. Examples. If you've ever heard of the Enuma Elish, it is the Babylonian creation epic where Marduk goes out and fights the god, the chaos god of the waters, the salt waters, Tiamat. And the gods empower Marduk with a bunch of weapons. He goes out, he slays the chaotic sea dragon that is Tiamat. And then he rips her in half and then uses half of her to build the sky and half of her to build the land and the seas and stuff. And then orders the gods into their various states of existence. Another one, well, let me just say this. It's important to know that the Babylonian Genesis creation story that is Enuma Elish, because who are the Old Testament Hebrews interacting with? Who sends Israel into exile? Judah into exile. Babylon. They would have known Enuma Elish. They would have known the epic creation story, and they will take from pictures of Marduk versus Tiamat and apply it to Yahweh versus Leviathan versus Rechav versus, whoever it helps them make their case to when they're writing. They will steal from other religions and other pictures of pagan gods. The Baal cycle. Baal is the god that Israel is constantly worshiping in Kings. You can find a copy of the Baal cycle. It comes in two, it's not that long, and the story itself, there's mostly notes at the back of this. It's not even the story itself, because it has two quick little stories. The victorious Baal, where Baal goes out to fight Yam, the chaotic sea dragon of the waters, and he kills and slays Yam, and then he uses Yam's death to become king of the gods and order creation. The next one is Baal versus Mot, where he has to conquer death. Mot is the god of death. Yam is the god of the sea. Mot is Hebrew for death. Yam is is Hebrew for water. For the basis for other religions, I don't know what the basis for them would and would not be. The basis for your biblical language to describe it is largely going to come from these guys, because we know that in the time frame of the biblical authors, they're living under and interacting with these cultures. The Baal cycle comes from the Ugaritic Phoenicians just north of Israel. They're the ones that Jeroboam I turns into idol worship. And they turn that idol of that golden calf under Jeroboam I into worship of Baal alongside Yahweh. And then eventually they forget Yahweh and they turn it into other ones. Even if you think about more known creation myths like Greek mythology, where Kronos, the titan of time, is overthrown by his children. He swallows up his children until Zeus is hidden, and his son Zeus overthrows the Titans, leads the gods to rebel, and then slays time, conquers time, and is able to actually establish creation the way that he wants. And he orders the gods and he rules over them as their king. The biblical ideas and language is exactly these same ideas, but describing a different situation. Yahweh is not going to fight other gods to create, but he is going to fight chaos. He is going to push back chaos, and that is going to mean something on how we're supposed to live and address our lives. But we have to build and understand these stories out so that we know what we're doing. So you'll see imagery. This is Babylonian stones of Marduk versus Tiamat. This is a epic rendering of that. I just want you to see the chaotic sea dragon imagery versus one God, because that's Psalm 89 right there. That's Psalm 74 right there. The Old Testament psalmists, they knew what they were doing, giving Yahweh credit for what went to other gods. Yes, they're trying to explain what they saw and how they got there from their limited perspectives. And as they're being influenced and interacting with these other stories, they're going to use those other stories to tell the story of how Yahweh is king. Because this is what happens. When Marduk goes out, and all the other gods are scared of Tiamat. And so they give Marduk a bow, and he shoots Tiamat right in the mouth, down the gut, and kills her. Then he rips the rest of her open and builds the sky. Because their language was masculine and feminine. And because Apsu is her consort, is male, Tiamat is female. And so you couldn't miss it because the language is gendered. As is Hebrew. All Semitic languages are. This is Babylonian imagery, and Babylonian language is as gendered as most languages long before English. So the point is, the other gods are kind of scared, and they tell Marduk, hey, if you go out and you fight Tiamat and you slay Tiamat, if you win, we'll give you a bunch of weapons to help you, but we're not going out and fighting with you. She's got a bunch of other dragons and scary monsters and stuff. You go out and you fight her, you kill her, and if you win, we'll submit to you and you will be our king. And when he wins, he gets to tell the other gods what to do, and he gets to turn creation into what he wants. He gets to turn the chaotic, watery forces that are Tiamat all throughout the land into a dead version of herself, slain, and he can bring forth land, number the stars, count them, put them in their place, all things that Yahweh is given credit for in the Old Testament. Genesis is written by ancient Near Eastern Hebrews. This means that the story of God's creation in Genesis 1 must be read from the perspective of an ancient Near Eastern Hebrew. The Hebrews shared commonalities with their ancient neighbors in their view of the world while maintaining some distinctions between them. What I mean is that numbers 1 and 2 out of these three that I just shared with you, those are shared in common with all the other ancient Near Eastern cultures if you do apples to apples and actually examine these creation stories. Whether it's Babylon, Ugaritic in the north, Egyptian in the south, because we know they interacted with Egypt because they were their prisoners, whether it's even Greece down the line, they all share some commonalities because all ancient cultures thought in much closer ways than we do to any of them today. No matter how far the Egyptians or Greeks look from the Hebrews, they are still much closer to them than we ever will be. However, the Hebrew perspective will differ vastly when it comes to number 3. The gods don't go out and fight to establish creation. The fighting amongst the gods starts once Yahweh has established creation. But we'll come to that. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left, which is perfect because we've got 2 verses. So let us read the sacred text. In the beginning, the universe was created. This made a lot of people very angry and was been widely regarded as a bad move. Oh, sorry, no, this is from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Okay, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Quick question before we just break this down on one more slide. We got one more slide. What is necessary for all stories? What is the essence of all stories? In a single word, if you don't have this, you don't have the story. Your story is the resolution of what? It's so obvious, it's just not going to come to your mind, but you know the answer. Plot is the specific outpouring of solving what? Yeah, I was looking for the word conflict, but yeah, a problem. Your plot is solving the problem. How did these characters in these places go about solving this problem? That's the plot. Before evil ever enters the world, the story's conflict in the first creation story is not that there's some satanic serpent creature that wants to overthrow God. None of that is the thing. Humans haven't rebelled yet, but there is conflict. There is a problem. The earth is formless and empty, void. In Hebrew, it rhymes. It's tohu vavohu. You couldn't miss the idea of it. And darkness was over the surface of the deep. Wait. The deep, that's a term for water. Watery chaos. What's going on here? Why does material exist but not support life? That's the conflict. That's the problem. There's all this material around. And God is hovering over the waters. He's there. But notice where he's at. He's not looking down on the waters. He's down at the waters looking around. And he comes to realize this is no good. And then he will begin saying, let there be. And there will be. So this is the setting of the story, these first two verses. Verse 1 is an introductory statement to the story that will follow. It is a merism. Remember, I told you have to look for the literary devices. You have to think of the Bible like good literature, good ancient Hebraic literature. And from the very first verse in the Bible, you have a merism. In the beginning, when God came along and created everything, he created everything. The heavens above, the earth below. A merism for everything up there, everything down here. In the very first verse gives us credit to God for what creation is and where it came from. But here's the state of things when God began creating. That's what verse 2 is about. It was formless. It was empty. It had no purpose. It had no order. It had no life. Because that's how an ancient could conceive of a creation. It doesn't matter how much matter is there. It was a mess. It was an absolute and utter mess. And so somebody needs to come down to the primordial chaos, the great waters of nothingness called the deep. And God is there surveying the situation before he acts. And then he's going to act in a course of 7 days. And we will talk about what 7 means and why 7 and stuff in more detail later, and what a day is portraying there. But he's designing creation into a cosmic temple in their minds. That's all this first creation story of the Bible is trying to get us to think about. So let's think that way. Let's think about our lives as living in God's temple. And being God's temple, that's another way that you could describe it. But the physical universe that God wanted, he set it up so that it was like no matter where you go, you were living within God's home, living in his presence already before evil enters the world. If we can think like that, we can help recover what is our purpose in this world. So we will talk not only about the fact that God is ordering things as a cosmic temple, but that comes with responsibility and purpose. And we want to uncover what that responsibility and purpose is as we go through the days of creation in Genesis 1, as we go through the garden in Genesis 2, and as we break it all apart and rebel Genesis 3 through 11.